Ladies and gentlemen, good find. We'll tell you again from the EBS studio at what we call necessary dialogues. Matthias Corvinus Collegium cordially invite you to a new event in the Transylvania Lecture Series. In the discussion, Dr. Ashley Frawley and Dr. Ioan Hosu will discuss the role of mental health in society and how communication is a crucial element in understanding and addressing social issues. Present in the EBS studio at the moment is Dr. Ashley Frawley. Thank you for accepting our invitation. We are honored by your presence. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, Dr. Ashley Frawley is a sociologist at the University of Kent and visiting researcher at the Matthias Corvinus College in Brussels. He was a previously university lecturer in criminology, sociology, and social policy at Swansea University. She is the author of 2 books, Semiotics of Happiness, Rhetorical Beginnings of the Public Problem and Significant Emotion, Rhetoric and Social Problem in a Vulnerable Age. Well, it must be said from the beginning that social problems today are complex and varied. They differ according to region, culture, or a specific context. However, there are certain global themes and social issues that have been identified and as significant and affecting contemporary society. Many people tend to neglect their mental health, which brings them suffering and something hopelessness. What is important to consider, first of all, how can this stress be kept under control to maintain a general state of well-being?
Well, I think first of all, we need to be skeptical of the invitation to view our problems as stress, because how you define a problem invites a particular solution. And that's one of the core theses or the core themes of my 2 books, that we are increasingly invited to view the problems that face us, the most important, as you say, global issues, as essentially mental, as emotional, as things that, okay, maybe they might have social causes, but at the end of the day, what's really important is how they make you feel. And that's actually quite different from how most people have understood social problems historically. And it has some benefits, but it also has some drawbacks. How you define a problem invites a particular solution. So if the main problem facing us is our stress and our well-being, so okay, we might have problems in the workplace, okay, there might be this or that, but really, how does it make you feel? Then the solution is also emotional, is also about reducing stress. So just to give you an example of this, a few years back, I was on this show in the UK called The Big Questions on BBC. And one of the panelists was, at the time, the Welsh Well-Being of Future Generations Minister. And someone in the audience had asked, well, it's all well and good that you talk about happiness and well-being. That was the theme of the show. But we in the Welsh valleys don't have jobs. And the minister says, well, that's a really important point. And she starts doing this hand waving and she says, but what we're really talking about at the end of the day is our mental health. And it is a travesty in this country that we do not invest enough in mental health. And that's why we need to demand blah, blah. And I interrupted her and I said, nothing that you've just said has anything to do with what she's talking about. She's talking about jobs. And now we've slipped into talking about mental health support. Do you see how it happens? And now when we move these conversations into that area of emotion, then we have a conversation about mental health and well-being and how you feel. And really, do you need a job or do you need a professional to help you manage your emotions and you're upset about not having one? You see? So it's a very, very sly little trick. And it makes it sound like this is all very progressive and it's a social justice movement, that you should demand this. And now you're not talking about jobs anymore. You're demanding a mental health professional. So I think we need to be very careful and very skeptical about how we are invited to frame and think about the problems that face us. If we think about them as stress, the solution is to reduce stress. And that's not actually how most people have understood social issues. And just to add, excuse me, part of why this works, why this frame works, is that the self has become the anchor for meaning. Where is society going? What's the goal of our societies? Can you name one? No, we're very confused about that, right? We're very uncertain about even the idea of progress. When we talk about the human hand on the world or the human footprint, we mean that in a negative way. And so the self has increasingly become the anchor for purpose and meaning. And in that context, any kind of negative feeling becomes unbearable. But most people throughout history did not live as though they had one life to live. They lived as though they were living their parents' lives and their children's lives. Now that thread that attached people to the past and into the future has been cut, and all that you have is the self. And in that context, stress becomes something terrible, something unbearable. So I'm not sure we need to avoid stress. If you are going towards something that is meaningful, stress is incidental to that. So like journalists will go on hunger strikes in places that don't have, press freedom or whatever. And they're like, oh my God, it's not like they're saying, I can't bear this hunger. Surely it's unbearable. But what they are doing has meaning and purpose for them. So paradoxically, when the self is the end point of everything, all suffering becomes unbearable. And we become quite open to this idea that really at the end of the day, what we need to be dealing with is emotions, because we feel disempowered toward society and dealing with the future.
I understand. We catch ourselves at some point in life while running, binging in a continuous rush, and looking back, we see why we ran. Good or less good things. But a question surprises us. Where are we running? And what is our meaning? Naturally, we all have a purpose. Every man has his purpose and will find it when he is ready for it. But we look back. We rush, get tired, and end up stressed again because we haven't completed all our tasks. How to manage this continuous rush, and where are we going?
Well, I don't think that people necessarily do consider themselves to have meaning or purpose, and that's part of the issue, that there's been a broader loss of meaning in society. Like perhaps maybe in Romania you don't have this same feeling, but I grew up in Canada, and I grew up in what we call, as a sociologist, I call therapy culture. And that is a culture that has lost tradition and has lost a sense of certainty about how you're supposed to live. So when I was growing up, and therefore that has sort of filled that cultural void with therapeutic understandings, psychological understandings of the self becomes the main purpose. And I remember when I was growing up, I would ask my dad, what should I be? What should I do? And my dad would say, do what makes you happy. Just be happy. And I was like, what does that mean? I don't know what that means. Give me something. What does it mean to be a woman now? I don't know. What does it mean to be a man? I don't know. And so we look around, tradition no longer tells us what we're supposed to be. Now, again, that's not how people historically lived. 1,000 years ago, you would have known what it meant to be a woman because you'd have done exactly what your mother did and your grandmother and so on. You would have known that. Now that's gone. And we have this void, and we seek certainty. Now, on one hand, that void is a good thing because we have sort of unprecedented freedom in terms of how we can live. But on the other hand, we experience this freedom at a time where, again, as I said, the human kind of hand on the world is really problematized. It's seen as an issue. And so that freedom kind of comes with responsibility. And that's really scary. And so we sort of say, well, it's not me. I'm not making this choice. It's my genes. It's my family. It's what happened to me when I was a child. It's this, it's that. And so what I looked for was certainty. And where did I find it? In self-help books. 10 steps to a new you. Yes. How to manage your self-esteem. And I was miserable. Because as I said, if you have no purpose in life and your whole purpose is yourself and your own feelings, any negative feeling becomes unbearable because it's your whole purpose. It becomes an existential crisis when you feel bad. But if you're heading somewhere that has meaning, you don't mind necessarily feeling bad. And this is the issue that we have. We are increasingly encouraged to put the self and our feelings at the core and center of what makes life meaningful. That is a very shallow anchor for meaning because the self is always changing from day to day. You have ups, you have downs. Now you're encouraged to think about those ups and downs as your whole purpose of existence, leveling it out. Am I too happy? Am I too sad? Thinking about your feelings all the time sets you up for problems. It makes you you will find problems. If you think about your feelings all the time, I guarantee you will find problems. And I remember I used to put like affirmations up on my wall. Don't save your happiness up for the future. Be happy now. And I would think like, why can't I just be happy? And as I said, I was miserable. But when I found a purpose in my life, which was to understand the world in a deeper way, when I decided to go do a PhD and, I write books and so on, writing a book is not fun. It is a really terrible experience. I find writing is my job, and I find it difficult. It's really hard. But I do it, and I endure the stress, and I thrive sometimes on the stress because what I'm doing matters. And instead of sort of thinking about like, oh, how do I maintain my mental health? Thinking about a purpose beyond yourself is really what we should encourage people to do. But we do that less and less. We think about like marriage or a family. What does that mean? Oh, you have to learn to love yourself first before you can love another person. Why? Because we live in a world where everything is ephemeral, everything is slipping away, everything is changing. Your husband, your wife could leave you tomorrow. Your child could die. And if you don't have yourself, then you have nothing. And we encourage people to kind of view the attachments to other people as a problem. But the attachments to other people are what make life worth living. The fact that relationships could die, the fact that my children, God forbid, should pass away, that is what makes them so important. That's what makes living for them so important, because they could be taken away. But instead we sort of think, no, that's why we should keep our relationships at arm's length. And we should actually assure ourselves that we should be resilient to a world that's beyond our control. Only focus on yourself because everything else could go. It's a terrible existence to give people. So live for something beyond yourself that gives your life meaning, and you will be able to withstand a lot of stress. You'd be surprised.
Yeah. Live the moment. Don't think about the future.
Yes, exactly. That's the mantra of our time. Just live in the
no
moment.
Rush. Yes.
But the moment's always going. You're always going to feel like at a loss. You're trying so hard to hold on to the moment, to, feel the breeze and all these sorts of things. Be mindful. But it's always passing away. Always. And so you will always be living your life as though you're on a treadmill if you're trying to hold on to the present moment.
Well, the increasing cases of mental health disorders is an important social problem. However, the stigmatization of people with problems remains, in our country, a difficult truth to perceive. What can you tell us from this point of view?
So I think we need to look a little bit more closely at some of the claims that we have an increase in mental health disorders. It is certainly the case that some mental health disorders have increased, but we also need to understand that the disorders themselves have expanded. So over time, we have seen the sorts of things that are considered a disorder. The criteria that you need to meet them have got much more broad. And so gradually they have expanded to encompass more and more aspects of everyday life. And so it catches more people, so that's part of it. The other thing is we are encouraged more and more, as I said, to think about the self and to be aware of our emotions and that sort of thing. And also, increasing, it's the argument that I make in my new book, increasingly our feelings, our emotions have become symptoms. And the ideal subject is always thinking about their feelings and on the lookout for symptoms. And gradually, more and more feelings become symptoms. So stress, sadness, sometimes people say feeling down, these become mental health problems. They become medicalized. And as more and more of our life becomes medicalized, more and more of our feelings become medicalized, we start to see ourselves as patients. So that's two reasons why mental health disorders have increased. The other one is obviously we recognize certain like very severe mental disorders, things that are quite outside normality. We're more likely to recognize, and I think that's a good thing, more likely to recognize and treat that sort of thing. But I think we have to be very, very careful when we say that there's just been this overall increase in mental health disorders. There's a lot going on behind that. The other thing is that there are certain things that are defined as mental health disorders, but that are also actively encouraged by our society. Anxiety is a good example of that. That's one disorder that has actually increased, and the sort of different disorders that are labeled with various forms of anxiety, these have all increased. We also live in a culture that encourages us to be anxious. As a good citizen, you should be aware and anxious about the world. You should be aware of climate change. You should be aware of what's happening in the global south. You should be aware of this problem and that problem. You should be thinking about cancer. If I walk through corridors of a university, these are young people, right? On the walls, there are posters that say, "Are you breast aware? Are you testicle aware, young man? Do you feel your testicles on a regular basis?" That you should be thinking about the fact I might have cancer. Is this fever just a fever? Or is it a sign of leukemia? And so you are encouraged to think about your body all the time and your feelings all the time. Be on the lookout for symptoms, not only of mental disorders, but possibly of medical disorders, and be aware of the problems of the world. Look at like Greta Thunberg. How dare you carry on your lives as normal? You must be anxious. You must be anxious. At Christmas in Canada, we had protesters disrupting children going to see Santa Claus. How dare you just live your life as though nothing... What is a child going to Santa going to do about Israel? That's what they were upset about. Jesus was a Palestinian, this sort of thing. What's a child got to do with that? But the idea is, as a good citizen, you should not just carry on your life. You should be worried. You should be anxious. And this is an illness. You see? So we have to be very clear about how our culture medicalizes more and more of everyday life, encourages us to be aware of our feelings and to think of them as symptoms, and also about how some of these disorders are the outgrowth of an active encouragement to be a kind of anxious citizen. Now, about stigma, I'm not actually convinced that stigma is being reduced by all of this. We have a medicalization of everyday life, so more and more people who function at a pretty high level think of themselves as mentally ill, as having a disorder. Or we don't really say mental illness, we say mental health problems. They consider themselves to have mental health problems. But there are some people who are mentally ill. There are some people who really cannot function in society. Do we really serve them by encouraging people to think about mental health problems as just an everyday thing? Oh, this normal person that you see in the office, they might have a mental health problem. We've destigmatized thinking about emotions as symptoms. But have we actually destigmatized somebody who cannot function? What does somebody, there's a Harvard graduate or a Harvard student, I think, who has become like a spokesperson in a lot of ways for autism. What has that person got in common with someone with really profound autism who requires 24-hour care? Do we have a space for them in society? I'm not sure that we do. We've massively expanded provision for people with everyday stressors. But then people who really are experiencing like a psychotic break, they find it very, very difficult to get medical attention. They get passed around. Ooh, I don't want to deal with that mental illness thing. That's risky. That's scary. I want to promote mental health. I want to deal with the whole population. I just did some research in the UK where we did a lot of interviews with universities, people in universities, counselors, lecturers, people who have become involved in this new idea of the whole institution must promote mental health and well-being. And it was amazing how many of them said, I don't deal with that mental illness thing. No, I don't deal with that. So they want to deal with normal people and tell them they have mental health problems. But if you have a serious problem that means that you cannot integrate, they don't want anything to do with it. You get passed downstream. They get passed to someone else who gets passed to someone else. Yes, the institution wants you to identify yourself if you are a risk. That's what they're concerned about, that your behavior is risky. Identify yourself, but they don't want to treat that. They want to pass you on to the NHS. And the NHS goes, oh, I don't know what to do with you. Right. And so they keep getting bounced around. But, they'll tell you no problem is too small to bring to a counselor, right? Because they're worried about your behavior becoming a risk. But then people go there because their dogs die. And the counselor's like, well, what are you doing here? It's if your dog died. And I'm like, you told them to. You told them no problem is too small to take to a counselor. So you have these huge, long waiting lists because people have been disempowered to deal with the problems, the everyday problems of life in their own families and with their friends. They're explicitly told, no, that requires a professional. They go to professionals, and the professional's like, what are you doing here? And there's a massive waiting list. So then if you have a serious problem, you can't get to see a professional. So we've not actually destigmatized anything, I don't think. I think we're still quite afraid of mental illness. We still see it as a serious risk. Nobody wants to deal with it. What we have destigmatized is redefining the problems of everyday life as mental health problems.
Thank you. Let us also mention about another context that remains an important one. Economic differences between different social groups and country had led to a global problem of inequality and poverty, affecting access to essential resources such as education, health, and employment opportunities. How can international organizations help reduce economic inequalities between the countries?
I think they need to actually believe and be committed to solving those problems. Because increasingly, these have been the sort of wicked issues that policymakers feel they can do little about. I think that's part of what drives this tendency to medicalize everyday life, to transform what are material problems, economic problems, into mental problems, because I can deal with it then, right? It's what I was saying before about the minister who was she can't do much about jobs in the Welsh valleys. That's a complicated issue. It's really difficult. You've got environmental concerns. You've got problems with investment, lack of investment. It's complex. It's difficult. But I can give you a mental health professional, and those people need jobs anyway. So it becomes like this sort of job creation program for the middle class. But when it comes to sort of working class people getting jobs, they get therapy. So they need to actually have a commitment to dealing with economic problems, a commitment to development and investment. And we're moving away from that increasingly. We're encouraged to believe that progress is in your head, not out in the world. Right? So there's a huge movement now amongst economists and social scientists and so on to tell us that actually economic growth isn't important. Economic growth doesn't make you happy. And we should just refocus away from it. And now they're not saying that because they've got a lever and they're like, oh, economic growth, let's have some more. Oh, let's have a little bit less. No, our societies are experiencing serious problems growing. And in the face of that, instead of trying to understand why that's happening, they're like, well, it's not that important anyway. Let's refocus on something else. Oh, those darn people, if they could just be convinced to accept less, then we wouldn't really have this problem. So instead of dealing with the problem, they redefine it and they encourage us to look elsewhere. But the good thing is most people don't accept that. Most people do expect a better life for themselves and for their children. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think governments need to stop encouraging their populations, however ineffectively, to refocus away from economic growth to what really matters. And people need to be aware that that's a trick. And they shouldn't be ashamed to demand more and to demand a better life.
I understand. Well, massive flows of migrants and refugees due to wars have generated and continue to generate social problems, including tensions related to their integration into host societies. Here is another social problem we face. How can international policies address the problem of massive flows of migrants and refugees to ensure a more equitable distribution of responsibilities between countries?
I think, first of all, we need to recognize that these are global problems. And again, they're extremely complex, extremely difficult to deal with and extremely complex. And putting responsibility onto particular countries, the weaker countries that are less able to put up a fight, ignores the global context of issues and tends to deflect blame. So there's a problem happening somewhere in the world. Instead of talking, and that's pushing people out, instead of trying to understand, this conflict and its sort of deeper roots and that sort of thing, we refocus onto the country and we problematize the country that won't accept the refugees and the immigrants. We go, well, you're bad people. Well, what were you doing over there that pushed all these people in? Oh, I don't know. They don't want to talk about that. I think, again, it's where we are encouraged to focus, we should be skeptical. We are encouraged to think just about the problem countries that reject having enormous flows of migrants that they can't really deal with, that they don't have the infrastructure to deal with, that leads to all sorts of issues in terms of integration and so on. And they often put migrants into poorer communities that are having their own issues. And instead think about, who's causing these sorts of conflicts in the first place? Where are these problems stemming from? And deflect attention elsewhere and ask, what's really the root cause here? Why are we being asked to only focus on this? What have you been doing?
I understand. Well, let's talk about the other important things. there are various communications problems in society that can affect interpersonal relationships, communication, cohesions, and the effective functions of society as a whole. Well, a very important aspect is the face-to-face connection. We have forgotten about it since we live in the age of speed, and all socializing has moved to virtual space. We understand the age of technology means that on the one hand we communicate very easily anytime, anywhere, but again we face an obstacle. We communicate more via the internet and less face to face, which means it can lead to confusion, social isolations. What to do?
Well, I think on the one hand, people will talk about the necessity of face-to-face communication. But on the other hand, our interpersonal relationships and interactions with other people in real life are increasingly problematized. So just to give an example of this, like I met my husband 20 years ago almost, and I met him on a beach. And I was leering at him. I was making it quite clear, I am interested in you, that sort of thing. He got the idea. Now, and I think all of my relationships before I met my husband were probably something like that. In public, someone yelled and I turned around and that sort of thing. But now, this is harassment. This is dangerous. We are increasingly encouraged to think of our unmediated, unvetted relationships with each other as potential problems, as injurious to the self in some way. And so, if you look at how relationships start now, they're on dating apps. So you can kind of vet the person beforehand, and then before you meet that person, you are encouraged to think, oh, is it safe? I should go tell somebody, talk to somebody, and it may not be safe. Excuse me. And so our sort of unmediated relationships become fraught with difficulty. And you can see as more and more of life becomes sort of professionalized, is sort of subject to expertise, we are encouraged to doubt our relationships with each other, to keep them at arm's length. My students, for instance, will often talk about doing the emotional labor of dealing with someone's problem. So they'll say, oh, she's always dumping on me. I don't want to do the emotional labor of dealing with that. And what they're really saying is, something that used to be what friends did, which is sort of dump on each other and deal with each other's problems. Now, no, there's a professional for that. You're supposed to go and see a professional. I shouldn't be doing that emotional labor for free. That's something you should pay for. And so our interpersonal relationships, they're a problem. It's like, well, you're not trained to deal with that. I'm not trained to deal with your problems, like as though being a human requires special training. And so we become more and more isolated in terms of our technologies and so on. But this isolation is often implicitly encouraged as we are taught more and more about all the different ways in which our relationships with other people can damage us. The concept of abuse has expanded massively. So it's about emotional abuse, this sort of thing. So, the missteps that we make when we learn to deal with other people become refashioned as kinds of abuse. And like now, as a young man, are you going to go approach a woman in the street? Are you going to take the risks of making new connections just spontaneously? No, it's really scary. My nephew, for instance, is 17, and I feel terrible. I feel bad for him, like trying to navigate all of this. He's obsessed with Andrew Tate, but he doesn't actually live, Andrew Tate being like this sort of womanizing, fast cars kind of person. But does he actually live Andrew Tate's life? No, it's totally through a screen. Well, why would you take the risk of living like that when you can live vicariously through this person on a screen and watch a video, right? And and to actually go and approach a woman must be incredibly terrifying, right? So yes, we can talk about how important it is to have face-to-face connections, but we also need to recognize that being a human being and having relationships requires no special training. Yes, we're all bumbling fools when we go through life. That's what being human is, and that's okay.
Thank you. With so many communication channels and so much information available, people can become overwhelmed and have difficult filtering important information and communication effectively. What can you tell us about the information overload of today's society?
I think we need to be a little bit wary of this narrative because I think this notion of like information overload and there's just too much and we don't know how to sort through it, and really we need experts to guide us, has been a way of reducing the freedom of speech that we have and the freedom of access to information, supposedly on the basis of us being sort of weak, vulnerable people who don't quite know how to do this. Now, there are some things you can do to sort of shore up your, or to protect yourself against the kind of flood of information. And it's some, even experts and people that are held up as like, oh, the authorities in society, they produce tons of junk science all the time. They mash up statistics, they use risk ratios, they treat correlations causally. Nobody is immune from this. It's, when we speak in the public sphere, we use rhetoric and we are trying to convince people. And that affects communication in very particular ways. So you just have to watch out for that. Just because somebody is an authority on an issue doesn't mean you put your brain on a shelf. You watch out for particular things, numbers that are just too big. People say, every day this many people die and this is the biggest problem facing us. Or they'll say things like, such and such is the leading cause of death. Well, how many people die at that age to begin with? So they'll say, for instance, suicide is the leading cause of death amongst people aged this and this. But what they leave out, or it's like the second leading cause of death, what they leave out is the number of people who die at that age is very small. And that's actually a good thing for our society, that you don't die of disease as a child anymore, as a young person. But if you do die of something, it's in an accident or through, some kind of violence or through suicide. If you do die of anything, that's how you die. Not because the world has become much more violent and much more dangerous, but because we've got rid of death from all these other causes. But they don't tell you that, right? You get a narrative of decline. Our world is just terrible. Look, the leading cause of death is suicide. Yeah, but the numbers are very low. The numbers are very low just generally. So you need to watch out for this sort of thing. And so being a critical thinker and learning to kind of not be beguiled by claims to science is an important part of sorting through information overload and not just sort of taking somebody's authority at face value.
Thank you. And still related to communication, let's remember disinformation and the manipulation of information, the spread of fake news. Can erode public trust and create confusion in society. What can you tell us from this point of view? How do we protect ourselves against fake news?
Again, the whole narrative about disinformation and fake news can be used very disingenuously to try and limit the amount of information that we get and to control narratives on the part of people in power. So the last thing that anybody should want is a ministry of truth. Because we all know, we've all read Orwell, right? We've all read 1984. The ministry of truth becomes anything but. And we've already seen this now with governments talking about misinformation, where they will say things they'll say, well, this thing isn't necessarily untrue, but it might be dangerous, so it should be controlled. So this new concept of malinformation, information that's not necessarily incorrect, but could be dangerous, right? And so this already starts to show us the danger of us sort of saying, oh yeah, there's too much fake news and too much disinformation. Okay, you be the arbiter of truth then. No. The solution to disinformation is more information and using your critical faculties to sort through it. And now we sort of say, well, most people don't have that. Well, it's the best thing that we've got, okay? The best thing that we've got is a belief in human beings to come together through democratic structures and to decide what we do as a society. To kind of bequeath that power to an authority is something I think very, very dangerous. And we've gone down that path in the 20th century. It didn't lead anywhere good. So we have to have faith in ourselves, the population, and not sort of be sucked into this idea that actually most people are stupid. I'm the exception, of course. Most people are stupid, they can't be trusted, therefore you should have the power to decide what is truth. We should be able to control information. I think the other thing too is what harms trust, what erodes public trust, is not being honest about the necessity of uncertainty in science. Science in the public sphere often gets used in a quasi-religious way, which is completely anathema to what science is about. Science is about uncertainty, right? And it's a profoundly human thing. Because, in the past, you had the book. It was often written in Latin, and there was a special person imbued with special power to understand and interpret the book, the Bible, right? Or whatever it was, a religious text. And then with our revolutions, Protestant reforms and that sort of thing, we opened that book to everybody. And we said, you fellow human can read this or do this experiment or whatever it might be, and you can come to the same conclusions that I have. Or we can have a debate about what is the correct conclusion to come to. It's a profoundly human thing. Instead, what we get now is science says this, therefore it's true. No. Science has come to the conclusion that this is probably the best way of understanding things, but we recognize that science is not infallible. All sorts of things can influence the kinds of questions we even give to science, and there's always openness to debate. And conclusions are always tentative. They can be really, really strong conclusions, but we have an open mind that perhaps something may add to our knowledge in the future. This tendency to say, no, science says so, this is how you should behave. And then, a few weeks later we go, oh, well, actually it looks now like blah, blah, blah. People are like, well, I'm not going to listen to science then. That erodes public trust. We need to be honest about the necessity of uncertainty and that that's okay.
Well, what can you tell us about the books you've written? Semiotics of Happiness, Rhetorical Beginnings of the Public Problem, one of the book, and the other book, Significant Emotions, Rhetoric as Social Problems in a Vulnerable Age. What you can tell about those?
Sure. So I've never really been interested in telling people how to be happy, but I was interested in why at a certain point people who set themselves up as experts became interested in telling people how to be happy, and how they claimed that this was not something you as a layperson have access to or can really know about, but that required specialized scientific expertise. And for me, this represented the further encroachment of a kind of expertise or professional way of understanding things into more and more aspects of everyday life. So before part of this whole idea of like happiness is a social problem, happiness is a science, happiness is something psychologists should pay attention to. This was supposed to sort of refocus the psi disciplines, or the disciplines that begin with psi, PSY. It was supposed to refocus them onto what really matters in life, the bright side of the human condition. Why do we always focus on problems? We should focus on what makes people happy. Sounds good, sounds really positive, right? But in the past, when you focused on problems, what you were really saying is, once we remove this problem, you will be free to do what you want. You will get past this impediment and you will flourish. Now what we're saying is, even to flourish requires my expertise. You need help not just when things go wrong, but for things to go well. So that area of life that's subject to expertise expands, and you become disempowered, and you are explicitly told, you can't deal with this. You are wrong about what makes you happy. And that was one of the big claims that I talk about in the book that emerged as powerful from this sort of happiness movement was human beings are very stupid when it comes to what makes them happy. They're like hamsters on a treadmill, they say. And in addition, that this inability to decide or to find what truly makes them happy is the root of a huge range of social problems. So if we could just go into schools and teach people the correct way to be happy, then we will solve all these problems. But the problems of society are much deeper than how people find happiness. And so inevitably, and in my new book, I noticed, after studying happiness, in 2008, when I first started studying it, I would go to conferences and I would get tons of pushback. No, this is a science. Oh, you're just dismissing all these scientific studies. No, there's a science as hard as nails that underpins that happiness is the cause of and solution to a range of problems. And we know scientifically what makes people happy. We should teach it, blah, blah, blah. Tons of pushback. 2015, I published that book. And people said, yeah, of course, that was silly. That's a pseudoscience. My most cited paper, 115 citations, is a critique all of the problems with this flimsy science of happiness. Now that's just, cited hundreds of times. But people have moved on to something else. Oh yeah, that happiness thing, that was really silly. What we really should be focusing on is mindfulness. What we should really be focusing on is well-being, mental health. That's what we really need to promote. And before the happiness movement, there was the self-esteem movement of the 90s. And the self-esteem movement said very similar things. They said, really the problem is people have low self-esteem. And if we could teach people self-efficacy, then we would solve all these problems. They called it a social vaccine. Teach young people how to feel good about themselves, and you will vaccinate them from mental illness in the future. Do you think that happened in the 90s?
Don't think so.
No, it did not happen. And the happiness movement, they promoted it on the same basis. They called it an inoculation. Same metaphor. It's going to inoculate young people against future problems. No, all it did was make people focus more and more upon themselves. And the thing is, inevitably, when these movements fail to solve the problems they claim they will, we don't say, well, maybe we've misunderstood the problem. Maybe the problems that face us are not emotional. They say, gosh, people are more messed up than we thought. We must try harder. We must go deeper. We must control behavior even more. And so this is what I'm arguing in this book, that there have been critiques. There's critiques of the self-esteem movement, critiques of the happiness movement, critiques of well-being, but we're not penetrating deeper into what exactly is driving this tendency to frame every problem that faces us in terms of mental health, well-being, emotion. Why can we not dig deeper to bridge the gap between what is and what ought to be? And that's the argument that I make, that we are stuck in the abyss between what is now and a world we kind of know is possible. You know, we live in a world of like extreme wealth, and we're told all the time, you can't have it. You can't have that wealth, you know, that, we're like, oh, there's going to be food shortages and we're burning wheat. You know, it's insane. And we can't figure out, well, gosh, I don't know how to do it. And so don't worry, we can live happily in the abyss. It's not a bad abyss. You know, you can put some curtains up, put a prayer mat down on the floor, learn to meditate. It's great. We learn to live in the void. But people are not happy in the void. And that's not because there's something wrong with us. It's because there's something wrong with the void.
Right. In the second book, you mentioned age of emotion. What does this age of emotion refer to?
We don't live in the age of emotion like emotions are celebrated. We live in the age of the problem of emotion. That emotions are increasingly set up as the cause and solution to a huge range of problems. And we are increasingly retreating from the real world of material possibility. And instead of trying to reform or change the structures of society, we seek to reform and change the structures of the individual. And the underlying narrative is, if I could just change the way that you think and feel, I will change the way you behave. Because really the problem is you. The problem is you will just not do what you are supposed to do. You will not choose the right things. Instead of understanding, like, actually, in the context of people's lives, choices that appear irrational at the sort of aggregate level can be quite rational. You know, smoking, for example. It's like, oh, well, why are poor people so irrational? Why do they smoke? You have to understand, like, in a life with so few pleasures, a cigarette is the one thing that gives you a tiny bit of joy, right? And it's not because the people are irrational. That sort of thing can be quite a rational response to a condition that doesn't store good things up for the future. Right? So people will say, oh, well, why don't poor people plan for the future? Because if you try to save money, people will steal it, you know? Like there's this wonderful Eminem song, you know, Marshall Mathers, where he talks, it's so sad, but he talks about how he's rapping to his daughter, and he says, we put our coins in a jar, almost had $1,000 until someone broke in and stole it. That's what it's like to be poor. That's why you don't save things up for the future. I know, I've been there. When we had food when I was a kid, we were like, we'd eat it. I don't know when food's coming again. You know, when I had nice things, they got stolen. That's the reality of life. It's not about people's bad choices, but increasingly we're like, no, you know, what is poverty? I mean, we can't really do much about that, but I can change the way you think and I can change the way you behave, and maybe you'll make better choices. But those choices make sense in a particular context. And I think that's something that we are losing in this sort of age of emotion that emotionalizes all problems. We're losing a focus on the material world, and we are disempowering people from focusing on that and trying to change it.
I understand. What do you know about Romanians? Have you had exchanges of opinions, collaborations with people from our country so far?
I have, and people have the people that I've talked to, there tends to be this sort of sense that like Romania is back, Romania is behind, that the understanding of mental health and promotion of well-being and focusing on our feelings and this sort of thing, that's actually quite progressive, and we're behind, we need to catch up. You're not. You're not. That you think this isn't your part of your culture, it's coming for you. Don't be complacent. And this is how we kind of get caught in this sort of world of emotional problems and understanding everything as emotional problems, that it is presented as very progressive, as the forefront of science. But as that, there have been tons and tons of critiques that point out that a lot of the science is really junky. Right now, psychology, and there's a lot of great stuff in psychology, and there's a lot of junk in psychology. Same thing with my own profession, sociology. Lots of junk in sociology, but lots of good stuff too. But there's psychology is going through something called a replication crisis. Some of the big sort of findings that are held up as like, oh, the science says this, have not been replicated. Some of them have been utter gobbledygook. So a very, very famous example of this is Barbara Fredrickson's positivity ratios, where she says that she claimed, her and her co-author had claimed to have found the exact ratio of good experiences to bad experiences necessary to flourish, which nobody seemed to realize would be utterly new for anything to say across every culture, across every class, across all genders, across everything. All genders, across both genders, like across everything, there's a ratio, an exact ratio necessary for good experiences to bad experiences. That would be utterly unprecedented. Nobody thought that. It became this thing. She's, a business was started on that paper, was cited 400 times, till finally one day, I think it was an engineer or something like that, somebody who knew about the maths that were used to produce this ratio, was sitting in a lecture as the lecturer was sort of saying, oh, and this is the positivity ratio and blah, 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 and this science. He's looking at the equations and he says, this is gobbledygook. It's just made up. And nobody knew because everyone went, ooh, sciencey. And there was a very impressive graph in the paper. And no, it was totally made up. And it had spawned a whole industry. So do not be fooled that this is the forefront of science. It is not necessarily so. Do not, I think you still have faith in yourselves and in your relationships. Don't give it up to a professional. As I said, everyday life does not necessarily require specialized expertise. Human beings have always brought their problems to each other, to their families and to their friends. There's something very powerful and important in that. Don't lose faith in yourselves.
Yeah. What will appeal most the Romanians in Romania? What do you like when think of Romania?
Well, as I said, I think that people seem to still have interpersonal relationships, that not everything is viewed as needing to be outsourced to an expert or to a professional. I don't know if it seemed kind of weird to people here that so many people think like, oh, if I have this problem, it's something I need to bring to a professional. And actually, I can't solve it on my own. And trying to solve it on my own is very dangerous and risky. That's a very common idea in the English-speaking world. It's an idea that I had for myself as well when I was growing up. I thought I just could never get over these problems until I saw a professional, until I read Frank Furedi's 2004 book, Therapy Culture. And I went, oh, a lot of this stuff is just made up. Okay, let's deal with this then. And I became incredibly empowered. So I think that these ideas seem very foreign to you. I think you still have a sense of yourselves that you can help each other, that you talk to each other about your problems. I think that's really great. And I think, don't lose that.
Dr. Ashley Frawley, excuse my English. Thank you and wish you much success.
Thanks very much.
EBS Radio.